So last week, we were in chapter 17 and we talked about it was a spiritual adultery that was being referenced. So back at that point, the prostitute that was riding the beast, and the beast, of course, is what we refer to as the Antichrist, and the prostitute is in essence false religion, is what it is. And as we dive into it, though, it's very important to understand that in chapter 17, verse 4, it says right there, the woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold and precious stones and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. So that's the spiritual adultery piece in 17. When we get over to verse 18, we're going to see, I went out. I didn't do that right. I didn't do that right. 17:4, where are you? There you go. Over in verse 16, it says, and they cry out, woe, woe to you, great city, dressed in fine linen, purple, scarlet, with glittering gold and precious stones and pearls. So there, in verse 18, we're looking at it's referred to as a city. In verse 17, she's referred to as a prostitute. They're the same thing. So, so as we dive into this is just a continuation of what we were reading in verse 17 just now about the merchants and the kings and the adultery that they committed with the false religion is in essence what's happening. So verse 1, chapter 18. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had a great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. So when this angel descends, the whole earth is lit up by the splendor of this angel. Now, if you remember, there was another time some shepherds were hanging out in a field about 90 years before this happened. And at that point, maybe 100 years before that happened. And if you remember, these shepherds were hanging out and angels came out of heaven with a message about a savior that had just been born. And they lit up the sky that the angels were under. And here's one angel coming down from heaven, descending with great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. Now, this isn't even Jesus, because remember, when we get over to, I'm really anxious to get over to when we get to the end of this, and we'll start talking about what the new heaven and the new earth is going to be like and things like that. And there is no sun because God is the light that is there. And so Jesus, when he shows up, most of the time people can't look at him, his brilliance. This angel, John seeing coming down, and there's great illumination across the earth. With a mighty voice, he shouted, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become, and before we go any further, flip back over to chapter 14. This is where the three angels came out right after the mark of the beast, and the second angel in verse 8. And a second angel followed, saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries. So remember, that was already back in chapter 14. This same message, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling for demons, a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries, just like it was said in chapter 14. Now, before we move on, I want to move back over. There's some Isaiah and some Jeremiah that we're going to look at that kind of validates what's going on here. So some people, as we talked last week, some scholars believe that Babylon is a real city that gets rebuilt, and that is going to be the economic and the spiritual center of the world when the tribulation period is happening. That could be. there's a lot of great arguments for that. Some people look at it as Rome. And we talked about the pagan practices that came from Babylon into the church, the state religion that ultimately became Catholicism, and how all those Babylonian practices of the fault of in essence, an anti-Christ religion, all of that got moved into the state religion when Rome, Constantine legalized Christianity, and that started to commingle. And about 300 years later, then the first pope shows up on the scene, and then the Dark Ages ensue at that point. And interestingly, I looked tonight at how many people were killed, how many Christians were killed during the Dark Ages, and by the Catholic Church in the Inquisition. And it's somewhere between 50 and 100 million Christians were killed by the state church at that time. Really horrible stuff. So we have this false religion, fallen into Babylon. I fall into the camp of it is a spiritual anti-Christ spirit, that this particular mystery Babylon, just like we read back over in chapter 17, the Babylon, it was what was on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth. It's a spirit, not a city, in my opinion. You should do your own research and come to your own conclusion, because a lot of people think it's a real city, and there's reasons for that. So let's pop back over to, well, let's go to Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah 51. And we'll just go, there's lots of different areas here, but in Jeremiah 51:37 specifically, Babylon will be a heap of ruins, a haunt of jackals, an object of horror and scorn, a place where no one lives. And what do we got over here? She has become a dwelling for demons, a haunt for every impure spirit, unclean bird, and detestable animals. So this was back over in Jeremiah. This is when there's still captivity happening, and all of the Jews, the Israelites, need to get out. And there's going to be an overthrowing of Babylon at that point. This is a destruction of Babylon, and that's why many scholars fall into the camp of, well, it was never destroyed, so the city is going to be destroyed, so it must be a real city. I looked at Babylon. I've been looking at it this week, seeing what's there. There ain't nothing in Babylon, let me just tell you. There's like a big gate, but there's not even walls around it, I don't think. You know, Babylon, if you remember, well, maybe you never saw this, but Babylon had walls that were like 80 feet tall and some 60 feet deep. Very, very, very large walls. And so that built all the way around the city, and it stood on the Euphrates that went through it. So it was on both sides of that, and so there was a very formidable city that they thought could never be penetrated, and until they dammed up the water. Cyrus dammed up the water, and then they could just walk under the wall and took out Belshazzar. But that's a whole nother story for another day. So here now, back over in Jeremiah, this is, hundreds of years before, he's making this prophecy about Babylon will be a heap of ruins. It goes on down. This is still Jeremiah 51, verse 43. Her towns will be desolate and dry. Her towns will be desolate, a dry and desert land, a land where no one lives. The nations will no longer stream to him, and the wall of Babylon will fall. So this is that big, great wall, and I don't even know that it's there right now. I don't think the wall is there any longer. That's why I was looking at images, and I didn't see one. So it could be that the walls have already been taken down, probably have. But again, the whole point of this is that it's an overthrow, not a destruction. A lot of Bible scholars believe that even Jeremiah 51, and when we get over to Isaiah, it's still referencing an end time destruction of a real Babylon, like we're looking at here in chapter 18. Quick breath, questions, comments, clarification.
So to get it straight in my brain, I could be wrong, maybe a stupid question, but Babylon is not a city?
Babylon is a city. There's a real
Okay,
city called Babylon. That's 100% true. The question is the Babylon that they're referencing here, is it the economic and spiritual center of the universe that maybe the Antichrist sets up shop in, that God actually overthrows and destroys? Or is it a spiritual metaphor for a false religion that gets overthrown? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it is a real city. It's kind of like Saddam Hussein 20 years ago was trying to rebuild Babylon.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh,
yeah. Yep. He had coins minted, and on the coins, one side was Nebuchadnezzar, the other was Saddam Hussein's picture.
Oh, wow.
Because Nebuchadnezzar was the greatest ruler in Babylonian history.
Is Saddam still alive?
Well, we all think not. And,
I see. Okay.
pretty sure he was executed, but
Yeah, I hear you.
I don't know if JFK may still be alive. I don't know. It's just.
Well, they say Elvis is. What can I say?
So it's just, who knows? But the answer is everybody believes he's not alive. He was. Right. Let's slide over to Jeremiah 50. Slide one chapter left and start in verse 35. And it's a prophecy against Babylon. A sword against the Babylonians, declares the Lord, against those who live in Babylon and against her officials and wise men. A sword against her false prophets. They will become fools. A sword against her warriors. They will be filled with terror. A sword against her horses and chariots and all the foreigners in her ranks. They will become weaklings. A sword against her treasuries, and they will be plundered. A drought on her waters. They will dry up. For it is a land of idols that will go mad with terror. Desert creatures and hyenas will live there, and there the owl will dwell. It will never again be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation. So again, part of the argument that of those who say it's still the Babylon that's there is that people still live there. And this particular prophecy says that there will be no inhabitation from generation to generation. Now, my contention is because this is so late in the 7-year tribulation period, it could be that there will be no generations living there once Jesus establishes his 1,000-year reign, which we're going to get to in 2 chapters. His 1,000-year reign begins, and it could be that during the millennium that there will be no life in Babylon, period. That could be. So everybody, each person needs to really understand, and you can now, scholars have been going back and forth on this for hundreds of years, if not thousands, and still have differing opinions. So I don't know if we're going to get to the actual, but there's a good argument for it being it is a real city, but is this in chapter 18 the economic center of the universe? That's the real question. Or is it a metaphor for all the kings and the merchants of the earth dwellers, not believers, because we're all gone? Is that the city center, or does it represent Rome, or does it represent the Vatican? And so there's lots of theories on this. Any more questions? Feel free to fire away. All right, before we move on, let's go over to Isaiah. So we're just stay over there in Isaiah chapter 51. I'm just going to reread this. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling for demons, a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, unclean, detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. Okay. When we get over to verse 6, it's going to say, give back to her as she has given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Pour her a double portion from her own cup. Now, back over in Isaiah 51, starting in verse 17, and we'll go to verse 24. Awake, awake, rise up. What's the city reference there?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Rise up, Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath. So God punished Israel for their disobedience way back in Exodus and Joshua, way back. As the Israelites were moving on and Moses was about to die, he gave blessings and cursings. If you do this, God's saying, I will bless you. If you follow my rules, I'll bless you. If you don't, you'll be cursed. So, and for the next, I don't know, 1,500 years, they blew it. They kept they'd rebel, cry out to God, he would save them. Then they'd rebel, he'd cry out to God, he'd save them. And this went on, it's still going on, candidly. Because at the end, that's what's going to happen in Israel, is they're finally going to cry out to God, save us, and that's when Jesus comes back for the second time.
Oh, wow.
But they're in way disobedience right now. They're way outside, and they're a godless society at this point. Really sad. All right, so check it. Awake, awake, rise up, Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath. You who have drained to its dregs the goblet that makes people stagger. So what are we saying over here? For all of the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. And then and so this whole thing, there's a picture of people being drunk by drinking from the cup of the Lord, the wrath. Among all the children she bore, there was none to guide her. Among the children she reared, there was none to take her by the hand. These double calamities have come upon you. Who can comfort you? Ruin and destruction, famine and sword. Who can console you? Back over in 18, give her as much torment as the glory that she gave herself. Pour her a double portion. What does it say in here? These double calamities have come upon you. Your children have fainted. They lie at every street corner like antelope caught in a net. They are filled with the wrath of the Lord, with the rebuke of your God. Therefore, hear this, you afflicted one, Jerusalem, made drunk, but not with wine. It's because God has been punishing them for their disobedience yet again. Verse 22 of Isaiah 51, this is what your sovereign Lord says, your God who defends his people. See, I have taken out of your hand the cup that made you stagger. From that cup, the goblet of my wrath, you will never drink again. So I believe this is, again, end of what we're talking about over here in verse 18 is this from Isaiah 51. Israel has been under God's wrath since they rejected Christ. And they've had this cup of God's wrath, but then he says, you will never drink it again. What's he going to do in verse 23? I will put it into the hands of your tormentors who said to you, fall prostrate that we may walk on you, and made your back like the ground, like a street to be walked on. Back over here, what is this saying? We're going to get to this part here where it talks about now. Well, let me do it. I'm just going to do it. I'm going to be bouncing all over. Now this is verse 4. I heard another voice from heaven say, come out of her, my people. Going to come back to all that, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues, for her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crime. Give back to her as she has given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Pour her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. So this is now like he's taken this cup of wrath and given it now to Babylon, this false religion, and could be a real city. I believe it's a false system. And now that system that has been tormenting Israel is now going to take the cup of wrath, and they're going to start now to be tormented by it. And that's what we're going to see here over the rest of this chapter. All right, quick breath. Anybody, does this make sense? Do you need some clarification? Because I'm bouncing around a little bit.
It makes sense.
No, it makes total sense.
Hallelujah.
Even with the references, I absolutely am enjoying this because I can see it.
Spectacular. All right, now back over to chapter 18 of Revelation, verse 3. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries, just like we were reading. And the kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. So because remember, this is economic adultery. So whatever has happened here with Babylon, whether it's a political power, an economic power, a spiritual power. We saw that the spiritual power was there in chapter 17, but the political economic power turned on the false, like the false prophet, the religious piece of spiritual Babylon, and turned on it, and remember, killed it. We read this last week. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. So now what's left is this political, economic government, if you will, that's there. And now these kings of the earth and the merchants that have gotten rich by doing business with the prostitute Babylon, this system, now that he's talking about them. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. We're going to come back to that as we move over a few verses later. I have a note here. I'm as I read more and understand more, I grow more, because I have a note here. United States ? Is that the United States? And I no longer believe that. And not that I believed it because I had the question mark. I wondered at the time. That goes back years. Okay, verse 4. Then I heard another voice from heaven say, come out of her, my people, so that you do not share in her. What's the word? What's the next word?
Sins.
Sin, not wrath. Okay, they're not going to. So the people, if they were there on the earth at the time when God's wrath is poured out, then they would share in her wrath. What this is saying is, come out of the world system. 1 John 2:15, great reference. Don't need to turn there. Says this: do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. The world passes away, and that's what we're seeing right here. So he's saying, come out of her, my people. You are in the world, you are not of the world. John 17:14 is where you can see that. That's where you get the whole church. Not of this world. That's the point. We are in the world, we're not of it. He's saying, come out. Don't share in the maddening adulteries. All that's happening there, all the materialism, don't store up for yourselves things that rust, that moths eat. Don't worry about all the stuff of life. Don't get caught up in material things. Don't allow the world to own you. You can own things, we can have money, but it's when things and money have us that now it's a problem. Questions, comments, thoughts, input, argument? All right. I got a quick reference in Isaiah 48:20. What's that? 48:20. Read it here real quick. Oh, yeah. Okay. So right here it's saying, come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sin, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. Over here in Isaiah 48:20, it says, leave Babylon, flee from the Babylonians. So even back in Isaiah chapter 48, he's saying, come out. But that was in reference to their captivity and Babylon basically ruling over Israel. Come out of her. This is a different thing. Come out of her, my people. Come out of the world system so that you will not share in her sins and so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven. It's very interesting. You guys remember the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
What were they trying to do with the Tower of Babel?
Build it up to so they could go up to heaven.
And here, isn't it interesting that here her sins, Babylon, are piled up to heaven?
Whoa. Wow.
They wanted to build a tower to make themselves significant. This was where, remember the whole thing about Nimrod and Semiramis, Tammuz, all that stuff happened, and Nimrod was the ruler of the world at that point. And they wanted to build this tower based on their own efforts and their own, in essence, religion. It was anti-God because Nimrod, remember, he was a hunter in God's face. Yet here, they've piled their sins up to heaven. It's very interesting language.
How did they get him up there?
Well, it's just a metaphor.
Yeah. Okay.
And God has remembered her crimes.
Her what?
Crimes.
Crimes.
The crimes. So remember, and we're going to get into it. Remember, Babylon, the Antichrist. Remember, this is all Antichrist kind of stuff. Remember, there's all kinds of believers that came to faith after the rapture has happened. Most of them have been killed at this point. And so God is saying, I remembered her crimes. Again, does a city commit crimes? People commit crimes, not a city. That's why I believe it's a system that that controls people in essence. All inspired by the Antichrist, by, in essence, Satan. Verse 6. Give back to her as she has given, pay her back double for what she has done, pour her a double portion from her own cup. We talked about that earlier. So this is now the cup of wrath. Verse 7, give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. So this system has excess wealth. Again, this is just, we talked about this last week. I talked about how I believe part of that false religion has to do with the Catholic Church, the running of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is uber wealthy and involved in a lot of different political influence. How about that? And so while this may or may not be that, remember we talked about the city on 7 hills, the great city on 7 hills being Rome is known as the city on 7 hills. So is it Babylon? Is it Rome? Is it a system? Give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. And I have a note here from 17, 9, and 10, but that doesn't make sense what I'm looking at right there. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's why this calls for a mind with wisdom. The heads are on 7 hills on which the woman sits. That's, yeah, that was what it's talking about. Now, check this out. In her heart, she boasts, I sit enthroned as queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn. Okay, let's go back over to Isaiah. Flip over to Isaiah chapter 47. Isaiah 47:7. And it says, you said, now this is about Babylon. This is a prophecy against Babylon. You said, I am forever the eternal queen. But you did not consider the things or reflect on what might happen. Now then, listen, you lover of pleasure, lounging in your security and saying to yourself, I am, ooh, who does that sound like? And there is none beside me. This has got to be satanic. It's just a satanic move. I will never be a widow or suffer the loss of children. Both of these will overtake you in a moment, on a single day, the loss of children and widowhood. They will come on you in full measure. Back over to 18. Oh, my goodness. In her heart she boasts, I sit enthroned as a queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn. Therefore, in one day her plagues will overtake her. Death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. You guys see the similarity in the prophecies?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now remember, last week, we talked about Semiramis. She ultimately called herself the Queen of Heaven. And that's where the whole mother-child worship system came from.
Mhm.
And here she's saying, I will never be a widow, because Semiramis, Nimrod, who she was married to, died, and she was a widow. Then she made up the whole story about Tammuz being immaculately conceived, and him now being Nimrod reincarnated, basically. So she's no longer a widow because her dead husband has come back as her immaculately conceived son to become her husband again.
Reincarnation, huh?
And somehow everybody bought into it.
Wow.
Mess, just a mess. So again, this is my belief. As I look at this, it makes a lot of sense to me that the Babylonian system that started with Nimrod and them wanting to have their own, I'll use the word religion, even though it wasn't. It was just, they wanted their own worth. They did not care about the things of God. It was an anti-Christ system.
Mhm.
And in that whole thing, as we looked at all the different mother-child relationships and the worship of mother-child deities, if you will, that's where the whole Mary, Jesus worship came from. So here, saying now at the very end of the tribulation period, in her heart, she's still boasting, I sit enthroned as a queen. I'm not a widow. I will never mourn. Well, that changes. And it says here in verse 8, therefore in one day, and we're going to look, there's going to a couple more times we're going to see in 1 hour, but in one day her plagues will overtake her. Like she's there, defiant, and then she's no more. All right, questions, comments, input?
I have to be careful what you speak.
Yeah. Yep.
Wow.
All right. So again, some believe, just so you guys are, understand, some believe that what we just read is actually happening in the first half of the tribulation period, the first 3.5 years. They believe that this is happening then. That's what this is about. I struggle getting there. I can't see how it gets there, but I want to be really clear. It may be that I don't want to get there, and therefore I can't see how it can be in the first 3.5 years. So
Because the church will be taken out, we'll all be taken out ahead of that, so we wouldn't see it anyway, whether it happens or not.
true. If by chance Babylon is rebuilt and becomes the economic and spiritual center of the false religion, I see that as taking a long time to happen.
Mhm. Yeah.
And it doesn't fit with everything else I see concerning the setup for the return of Christ. So I'm saying that it might be my bias about it that wants to believe that this is a metaphor for the spiritual, a false religion or false religious system than an actual city. Does that make sense to everybody?
It
Yes.
does make sense. So the
Input, you
more
guys
that-
have some thoughts on this?
I do, Terry.
No.
Just all the references and everything that we've read thus far. So I don't know what's coming in the rest of Revelation. To me, it's the Catholic Church. If
Mhm.
you just, for me, I've done a lot of homework since we've been reading Revelation. I always go and look for something. And then last week you got me on a trail of other things about the mother-son relationship. And my sister used to go to a Catholic high school. So I have a little bit of experience with what they do. And just as we read about the luxury and all the things, it just adds up.
No. Yeah.
They get rid of nothing. It's all about them, monetary things, material things. It's crazy now that I can sit here so many years later and see it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. We'll come back to this when we get done here tonight. After I stop the recording, remind me to come back to this, okay? Because but I don't want to get off sidetracked on that for this particular study, just because there's still a lot to cover. But I am coming back to it. Okay. Anybody else? All right, verse 9. When the kings of the earth, and you remember that's back over in verse 3, the kings of the earth committed adultery with her. When the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared in her luxury see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her. Terrified at her torment, they will stand far off and cry, "Woe, woe to you, great city! You mighty city of Babylon, in 1 hour your doom has come." Again, some make a good case that because a city is burning, it is a real city. The question again is it Babylon rebuilt or something else? That's the question. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. So the merchants of the earth are all torqued. Why are they torqued?
Well, they were the those sacrifices of all those other religions, and now they don't have any more customers.
No customers. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn because no one buys their cargoes anymore. They're out of business. That's what's going on. They're like, wait, what the heck? It's like when Paul was preaching in the Greek towns and the Italian, the Roman towns, and their deities, Artemis. He's like, no, Artemis isn't even a god. She's got eyes that can't see, ears that can't hear, and a nose that can't smell, and a mouth that can't speak. And they're like, oh my gosh, this, and the blacksmiths are the guys that are having the issue because it's ruining their business. That's what it really came down to. So just like it was back in the day, it is today. You got to follow the money.
Mhm.
Mm.
So the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. And then it lists a whole bunch of these things. I won't go into them all. You guys see gold, silver, precious stones, citron, ivory, costly wood, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine and olive oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, and human beings sold as slaves. So you can just imagine going off to the market. Oh, we got to go get some milk and eggs. And I'm going to pick up a slave today too. And literally, that's kind of how it was. There was a slave market there. Human. And some of you guys are probably aware that human trafficking is as bad now as it's ever been. There's this ridiculous amount of human trafficking. So candidly, it's not out in the open, but people are still sold off into all kinds of different stuff. Horrible. But there's part of this is the reason there are 28 different things listed here. And it could be that the listing is here so that it's true. Like it's not a metaphor right now. These guys can no longer do business, period. And so I believe that's why there are so many specific things listed there, because it's real. It's a real thing.
Mhm.
Verse 14. They will say, the fruit you longed for is gone from you. All your luxury and splendor have vanished, never to be recovered. The merchants who sold these things and gained their wealth from her, the system, not necessarily the city, will stand far off, terrified at her torment. Why? Because remember the pouring out of the double portion, all the splendor and luxury she gave, now she's getting a double portion of torment, as we saw back over in verse 6. They will weep and mourn and cry out, woe, woe to you, great city. Again, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold and precious stones and pearls. And again, back over in 17:4, that was the prostitute. The woman dressed in purple and scarlet was glittering with gold and precious stones and pearls. It's the exact same description. The prostitute is the city. The prostitute represented a spiritual false religion, and I believe this is all wrapped together myself. Comments, input, anybody? Verse 17. In 1 hour, so remember back over in verse 8, it was in 1 day. Now, in 1 hour, such great wealth has been brought to ruin.
Mm.
And remember 1 John chapter 2 that I read, and it talked about that very thing. The lust of the eyes, lust of the pride of life comes from the Father. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God will live forever. So, so it's going to pass away, and here it is, and we're seeing it pass away right now. For in 1 hour, such great wealth has been brought to ruin. Every sea captain and all who traveled by ship, the sailors and all who earned their living from the sea will stand far off. They will see the smoke of her burning. They will exclaim, was there ever a city like this great city? And again, there it is. They're talking about a specific city. They will throw dust on their heads, and weeping and mourning, they will cry out, woe, woe to you, great city, where all who had ships on the sea became rich through her wealth. In 1 hour, she has been brought to ruin. So it's interesting because if you remember back over in the trumpets, the sea turned to blood. Maybe that was in the bowls. The sea turned to blood and all the fish and everything in it died. So are the sea captains still even doing anything? And then again, this is part of the reasoning that this is happening before all the plagues happen, because the sea captains are there. Now, it doesn't mean that they're still on the sea captaining or fishing or whatever it is they're doing. It just means they're lamenting over this,
Okay.
the fact that their businesses are gone as well. Everybody's business is gone because the economic engine has been destroyed. That's what it really is saying. Comments, thoughts, input?
This would be the period when you have to have the mark of the beast to be able to even purchase or any, do any kind of thing like that.
I believe all this is after the mark of the beast, yes.
Okay.
These are
That's
all earth-dwelling people, not believers who are in heaven, or believers who have been killed by definition in heaven.
Mhm.
So that's the second 3.5 years.
I believe so. I believe this is at the very end,
Yeah.
the way I read it. Meaning the very end, before Christ returns, before and sets up his 1,000-year reign. And it's all happening very quickly at this point. 1 day, 1 hour, this is all happening. I mean, heck, even back over in chapter 14, we saw that the angel was coming out and saying, hey, fallen, Babylon the Great is fallen.
Mhm.
And then after that, we then had all the plagues, the bowls and all the bowl judgments and everything. I believe those were happening very quickly as well. And so it's just like in when Moses went into Egypt, those plagues were happening, every couple of days. They were going back in. And so it doesn't take a long time for God to do these, particularly when he's got an angel that isn't arguing with him like Moses was. Well, I can't talk. Send somebody else, But now things change. Now things are starting to, the finality is happening. Verse 20. Rejoice. The only time in the book of Revelation this word exists. Rejoice over her, you heavens. Rejoice, you people of God. Rejoice, apostles and prophets. For God has judged her with the judgment she imposed on you. And in verse 19, or chapter 19, one chapter over, verse 2, he has condemned the great prostitute who corrupted the earth by her adulteries. He has avenged on her the blood of his servants. So again, this is in reference to the prostitute. Verse 21. Then a mighty angel, another one, picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone and threw it into the sea and said, with such violence, the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. The music of harpists and musicians, pipers and trumpeters will never be heard in you again. No worker of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a millstone will never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again. The voice of the bridegroom and the bride will never be heard in you again. Your merchants were the world's important people. By your magic spell, all the nations were led astray. In her was found the blood of the prophets and of God's holy people, all of who have been slaughtered on the earth. Now, obviously, persecution has been happening, well, forever. I can't, when you go back to the Old Testament, kings were killing kings and their subjects forever and ever. Persecution against the church specifically began pretty quickly right after Pentecost. People come into faith, and then all of a sudden, you know,
Jewish.
Paul got started, and there was great persecution that broke out maybe within, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years, and then for almost 300 years, massive persecution, but nothing like what happened in the Dark Ages in terms of numbers of people being killed, nothing like it. And so again, when I see your merchants were the world's important people, obviously there's important people tend to hang with important people who, you know, have self-importance, politicians, CEOs. You can see it right now, big tech, you know, all those people running together in bed with each other, and just keeping it really real. There's one guy from a religious standpoint that you see often with some of these world leaders, and it's the Pope. It's just a real thing. And so, and while he himself may not have been a person that killed many people, the church system, the false religious system that it represents, has. So again, it's why I believe that we're talking about Rome ultimately, and a system that is built on what has been happening through the Catholic Church. Not the Catholics. It's really important. The Roman Catholic Church. I put a video out about the difference between a Roman Catholic and a Catholic. I hope you guys saw that. It's on the Telegram group. If you didn't see it, it was very helpful for me. It was really helpful to understand the difference.
Mhm.
All right, questions, comments, throw down. Let's bring it on.
So Terry, you're talking about the Roman, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, you're talking about the Roman Catholics and the Catholics. Is there I'm pretty naive on this really. Is there a difference between the two?
Yes. And there's a video, John Barton did a video on it. I put it in the Telegram group in the Bible
Okay,
study.
the one just recently?
It was earlier this week, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And it was good. Good explanation of the differences. But
Okay.
ultimately, it was the state church that commingled all the other deities that was Rome, and that became a Roman Catholic Church. There are many Catholic people who have no idea about any of that. Many of them love Jesus, but it's the system that drives it that's the big deal.
Okay. Okay, I gotta listen to that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. The Templar Knights, you guys ever heard this? The Templar Knights?
Mhm.
No.
Back in the day, long time ago.
Well,
Right.
yeah. So Jonathan, who's he? The guy that plays Jesus in The Chosen?
Oh,
So there was just an interview with him just a little while ago, and he was knighted as a Templar Knight. That's a Mason. And
Okay.
and all of that there's a lot of Roman Catholicism deification in all of that. It's just a different thing, but it exists. It just not very visible to us. When I say us, I mean, you know, people that are just trying to live their life.
You know, when
So
my husband and I first became Christians, we started a church and we went to a Bible study. There was about 25 of us, and half of them were ex-Catholics. Half of them were ex-Catholics in that Bible study.
Meaning they went to a Catholic church and then they no longer did.
They were raised in the Catholic Church and changed as they got older for whatever
Yep.
reason. I don't know.
Yep.
But
Yeah, there's and again, it goes back to it goes back hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah.
The issue. But here in chapter 18, however one looks at Babylon, whether it's the actual Babylon that's rebuilt, whether it's Rome, the Vatican itself in Rome, both of those, or a system, political, governmental, false religious system. At the end of the day, it's all gone. And in chapter 19, we finally are going to get to the hallelujah for Babylon's fall, and then the false prophet and the beast thrown into the lake of fire, and 1,000 years begins in verse 20. So whew, we're getting to the end of the 7-year tribulation.
Wow.
Let me